Loving God, do not let us stray from you, the way, or misunderstand you, the truth, or worship anything other than you, the life.
Amen.
One by one, the brothers were brought out, and one by one, they were subjected to the worst punishments imaginable. All 8 of them, the mother included, were whipped by the Seleucid soldiers. No mercy was to be shown to these dissidents. Overlooking the procedures, notably with delight, was the king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Suddenly, one of the brothers spoke up in the midst of his torture, yelling, "We are ready to die rather than transgress the law of our ancestors." This only made the king mad. In a rage, he ordered that cauldrons be brought out and heated so that they might melt the young man alive. But that wasn't enough. He ordered that the boy's tongue be cut out, that his hands and feet be cut off, and that they scalp his head in front of the other 6 brothers and mother. When he was nearly dead but still breathing, Antiochus ordered that they throw the boy into the fire. Finally, the smoke of his burning flesh surrounded the remaining family, who continued to encourage one another in their faith. The soldiers soon grabbed the next brother. One by one they came, were asked to eat, and after refusing, died. Some were braver than others, sticking out their body parts willingly and proudly. Finally, after the smoke of their flesh had filled the area, the youngest brother was left, and Antiochus decided to appeal using a different means than merely fear. He promised the boy that he would be rich and made a friend of the king if he ate the meal of pork. This was, after all, what all of this had been about. They, as a family, had refused to eat the pig, and the consequences had proven dire. "Choose life," the king implored, but the young boy was equally stubborn and wouldn't listen, causing the king to order the mother to urge her son to take the offer. The mother deceitfully agreed, but in Hebrew spoke to the youngest, encouraging him to not give in, telling him that if he chose to die, he would be proven worthy of receiving a resurrection. Before she could finish speaking, the young boy proclaimed aloud that because of their deaths, God would begin to show mercy on his people. This finally enraged the king so much that he did worse to the youngest than anyone. Finally, having watched all her children killed, the mother could take it no more and flung herself into the fire, joining her children. It's not very often that when one comes to a text to preach, he or she is given a trampoline from which they can legitimately launch out of their given text, let alone out of the entire Bible. And yet, that is exactly the opportunity that has been presented to me with our text for this morning from the 11th chapter of Hebrews. Further down, in verse 35, the anonymous writer of the epistle mentions, among other nameless heroes of faith, that some, quote, were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. This odd reference, which many read but few Protestant readers understand, is an allusion to what is a very famous story. The only problem is that for Protestants, the story is no longer included in our Bibles, and as such has become forgotten. For the rest of Christendom, Catholics and the different Orthodox churches, the story is still found in their Old Testament, between the books of Esther and Job, in the work of 2nd Maccabees. To be brief, as homilies demand, one must be aware in this sermon of what so few Protestants sometimes are, that the majority of Christians around the world do not have the same Bible that we do. It's not just that our translations might differ, it's that they have more books than we do. And it's not because they added them, it's because we removed them. It's a long history, and an unconcluded one at that. At one point, even when Protestants declared books such as 2 Maccabees to be non-canonical, they still included them in their Bibles. But today, many are shocked just to learn that Bibles differ, let alone that our Bibles sometimes still reference the stories we took out. So although the story may not be found in our Protestant Bibles readily now, oddly enough, a sermon on a passage in Hebrews provides a Protestant such as me with the unique ability to preach a sermon from the Apocrypha. And so what does the writer of our letter say about these martyrs? He affirms that it was by faith that the 7 brothers did what they did. For Hebrews, as it has been for countless Christians for many centuries, the story of the Maccabean martyrs is a story of faith. Yet, I want to go deeper. The question I wish to ask this morning is whether faith indeed can be genuine, as our epistle in Hebrews affirms, but also misplaced. The central issue at stake in the story of the Maccabean martyrs was whether they would eat the pork that the Seleucid king was demanding they should eat. Notably, Antiochus didn't tell the brothers to renounce their God, nor did he tell them to stop being Jewish. This was not like the book of Daniel, where 3 youth were asked to worship another god. Instead, Antiochus wanted these 7 siblings to compromise on a single issue of diet. But how had it escalated to this point? Why was a Syrian king so concerned and obsessed with a Jewish family's decision not to eat pork? For those unfamiliar with the history of the Maccabean rebellion, the short version of what is told in 2 lengthy books is that a conflict initially arose between 2 groups of Jews, traditionalists and Hellenists, or if you please, conservatives and liberals. In the wake of Alexander the Great's exploits, the spread of Greek culture was widespread and for some seen as quite threatening. One group, the traditionalists, emphasized on one extreme that as Jews they could have nothing to do with Greek culture, Hellenism. If you hadn't guessed already, the martyred brothers of our story and their mother were part of this same group. On the other extreme were the Hellenists, who believed that the way toward the future of the Jewish people was to embrace Greek culture and to adapt to the changing times. They were fine with stopping circumcision, building gymnasiums, and it appears allowing pork to be consumed. That's a very simplistic depiction of a serious debate Judaism had in the 2nd century BC. But it suffices to give a portrait of why things turned south when Antiochus Epiphanes decided to get rid of the high priest who was a traditionalist and replace him with one that was a Hellenist. In the midst of this conflict, some of the more zealous conservatives began to take up arms and murder the liberals. And yes, these were the inspiration for the later zealots we read of in the New Testament. Eventually, this conflict became an all-out war, and the traditionalists who were left in Jerusalem suffered consequences for their convictions. Reflecting back on our story that I recounted earlier, what I think is important to note is that according to the implications of the mother's words to her youngest, if they don't resist the pork, they won't be found worthy and resurrected after they die. In other words, it's not simply their choice to stand up for something they believe in, but the belief that by standing up for it, it will assure that they will get something back. It's not a free gift of God's grace that they will be resurrected, but a reward for something they do while on earth. In other words, the mother is also saying that those Jews who did eat pork, those Jews would be lost. There would be no resurrection for those who shared different convictions, because God would give the resurrection as a reward only to those with the right convictions. This begs an interesting thought. What sort of faith did these young men and their mother actually have? That they had faith is without doubt, but was their faith misdirected? Paul, after all, was very clear in regard to dietary issues. In short, they were not in and of themselves something that determined salvation. Clearly, my small corner of Christendom, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, places a high emphasis on healthy living and on the dietary laws of Leviticus. Yet not even my church would be comfortable ever equating salvation with those food laws. And many Adventists today continue to eat pork regardless of any official stance of the church. And yet, clearly, the mother was under a different conviction about her salvation, a conviction that drove her to make the life and death decisions that she did. The whole story really forces us to pause and think. Ultimately, nothing prevented these young men and their mother from remaining Jews. Antiochus was not asking them to stop being Jewish, but to stop being a certain kind of Jew. They were being forced to change certain convictions or understandings of theirs, but their worship to Yahweh as God was not being initially forced to change. And so again, I wonder, were their convictions well placed? That they should have followed their convictions is not in question. Paul is lucid on this point. He writes in Romans 14 that God does not judge us whether we are right or wrong about food issues, but rather that we are judged regarding whatever conviction we have and how we follow it. In other words, using Paul's logic from 170 or so years later, the Maccabean martyrs could have been heroes of faith whether they ate the pork or didn't. They weren't heroes because they specifically refused, but because they followed their faith in their convictions. Thus, contrary to the mother's understanding, the pork-eating Jews had just as much a chance of being resurrected in the future as she thought she did by abstaining from it. The question that haunts me then remains the same. Were their convictions misplaced? Paul understood well in the context of Romans 14 and those he called the weaker brothers that poorly thought out convictions could have negative consequences for those that carried them. I'm reminded of a famous movie from 1966 called A Man for All Seasons. It was set during the period of the Reformation in Europe and followed a man of faith, Sir Thomas More, who refused to approve the divorce that the king of his country sought. To him, it was unbiblical. He also refused to accept the king's desire to separate from the Catholic Church. Against the pleas of his daughter and other clergy, he continued to fight and was put to death. He didn't have to. He chose to. Yet while the film glorifies him, his life haunts me. Why? Because the king was Henry VIII, and his desire to divorce was what led to the creation of the Church of England and the further development of the Protestant Reformation, later giving us an English Bible under King James, among many things. As Protestants, we'd strangely see that this man of faith, by fighting for his convictions on the Bible, was actually fighting against God's plan to bring about reform in the wider church. In the end, he literally died for nothing over an issue that God would ultimately use for a greater purpose. Though the traditionalists would win the Maccabean War ultimately, and the 7 brothers would be praised, as Christians, we should look back and feel oddly conflicted. They fought to the death and even murdered others to continue and enforce circumcising, yet we have given up the practice. They believed that if they ate pork, they would lose their salvation. And today, we see the issue as merely one of personal choice. They were against sports, gymnasiums, and the Greek way of life. And yet it was Paul, a Hellenized Jew trained in philosophy, who would later speak about running the great race, and who would ultimately take Christianity and spread it to the then Greco-Roman world. Almost everything they fought against during their initial conflicts, Christianity ended up accepting. In other words, if we traveled back in time, we might find that we now have more in common with the Hellenists than the traditionalists. So perhaps in the end, this homily has ended up leading us more to ask tough questions, causing us to reflect closer on our own lives than it has done to provide satisfying answers for the lives of those who have long since passed. As we reflect this Sabbath on the Maccabean siblings and their mother, their faith, and the culture wars that they found themselves in so many thousands of years ago, maybe they can help us to look differently at the culture wars we now find ourselves in and the legacies we hope to leave for others. How will our own convictions be remembered? Is it possible for us to have faith in biblical convictions and misplace it, failing to see a larger picture? Have we ever, do we now, And will we ever find ourselves fighting against things that will ultimately end up becoming part of God's plan in spite of our own convictions? The questions haunt me, as they should, and I hope that they will do the same for you.